Starting this up, let's focus on the documentation of your REST API. Your REST API consumers need to understand your REST API. They need to know what are the different resources that are being exposed, what are the different actions that can be performed, and they would also need to understand the request and response structure. They would need to understand what is the format of your request, what is the kind of response they can expect back, and do you have any constraints or validations. So your REST API consumers need to have really good understanding of your REST API so that they can play with it. Whenever we talk about REST API documentation, there are a number of challenges. How can you ensure that your documentation is up to date and correct? Accuracy is always a big challenge. Your documentation might get out of sync from that of code. Another important thing is consistency of your documentation. You might have hundreds of REST API in an enterprise. How do you ensure that the documentation for all these API is in a consistent format? Whenever we talk about REST API documentation, we have two options. One is manually maintain documentation. Basically, you can have a document or a HTML file where you maintain documentation related to your REST API. If you're manually maintaining the documentation, then you need to always put in the effort to make sure that it is in sync with code. The alternative is to generate the documentation from code. Earlier, we wrote the code for our user resource. Can we use this code to generate documentation for the user resource? So that's option 2, generating documentation based on your code. In this step, let's explore option 2, generating documentation for your REST API from code. There are two very important terms that you need to understand whenever we talk about REST API documentation. This is irrespective of the language you're making use of to develop your REST API. Whether you're building your REST API using Java, Python, Node.js, or any of the languages, these two terminology are pretty common. Number 1 is Swagger. Number 2 is OpenAPI. Let's take a quick peek into history to understand Swagger and OpenAPI. In 2011 was when Swagger Specification and Swagger tools were introduced. Around this time frame, we started to build a lot of REST API, and we needed a format in which we can document our REST API. That's where Swagger came in, and it provided a specification called Swagger Specification. And Swagger also provided a number of tools to visualize this specification, to make use of this specification. Swagger became really popular. It almost became the de facto standard for documenting your REST API. And in 2016, OpenAPI specification was created based on the Swagger specification. A number of large enterprises came in, and there was an open standard called OpenAPI specification, which was created as a standard for documenting your REST API. This was based on the Swagger specification. However, a very important thing to remember is that the Swagger tools continue to exist. So the Swagger specification became OpenAPI specification. However, Swagger tools, those are basically the tools to visualize and consume your REST API. They continue to exist. For example, Swagger UI. So OpenAPI specification, earlier this was called Swagger specification. This is nothing but a standard language agnostic interface to define your REST API. You can see an example of the OpenAPI specification in the left-hand side image. This specific example is using OpenAPI 3.0.1 version. As part of your OpenAPI specification, you can define where your specific REST API is exposed. What are the different resources that are being exposed? What are the actions that you can perform on your REST API? So your OpenAPI specification helps you to discover and understand REST API. This was earlier called Swagger specification. And Swagger UI helps you to visualize and interact with your REST API. Having this documentation is good. However, you'd want to have a tool which will enable you to interact with the REST API. Look at it in a more visually pleasing way. That's what Swagger UI provides you with. It provides a great UI around the OpenAPI specification, and it also enables you to easily play with your REST API. In this step, we got a quick introduction to some of the important things that you need to know about REST API documentation. We talked about OpenAPI, and we also talked about Swagger UI. In the next step, let's generate documentation for our REST API.